In question 1, we're given the following table here, and we're told that it represents percentages taken from fluid within a human kidney. We're then given this diagram here, and we're asked, given that it's labelled as follows, which letter on this diagram shows the most likely source of the fluid represented in this table? Okay, so before we have a look at the table and how it corresponds to what we see within the kidney, let's first remind ourselves of what's going on in this diagram. So we should be able to recognise that the portion in black is the nephron, which is the functional unit of kidney function. So we should see that we have another part here, which I've represented in red, but you can see in your diagram has arrows. This represents the vascular supply of the nephron. So this densely packed region here of capillaries is termed the glomerulus. And what happens at the interface between the glomerulus and the nephron, we should remind ourselves, is a process of ultrafiltration, which is where a certain portion of the vascular supply ends up in the kidney. So, moving on, we should be able to recognise that as this ultrafiltrated portion moves through the nephron, it passes through the proximal convoluted tubule, seen here, which is where most of the glucose is taken back up through active transport. This is to ensure that your body and your blood is not depleted of glucose just by the process of passing through the kidney. Then, the nephron is composed of the loop of Henle, in which you have water reabsorption to varying extents, and what you end up with is at point E, which is the collecting duct, this will then pass on to the ureter and then be urinated. Okay, so we've got a rough idea of what points A through E correspond to just by going through the structure. So let's remind ourselves of what's going on in the table. So we can see that we have a high water percentage, which is perhaps what we'd expect within the blood supply and the nephron at large. And we also have this percentage of urea. Now this doesn't especially help us unless we're already familiar with these relative percentages, which we're not. So the clues in this question come from two things. Firstly, we can see that the proteins are at 0%. Now that tells us that our answer can't be A, since that refers to the pre-nephron kidney blood supply, which will contain proteins. The whole point of ultrafiltration, which happens at the interface of the glomerulus and the nephron, is that proteins remain in the blood as they are too large to pass across the barrier between the glomerulus and the nephron. So this rules out A, and it also rules out D, which is the continuing blood supply, which will retain the proteins. So we've ruled out A and D. Now to work out which of B, C and E we need to consider, we can look at the fact that there's still some glucose within the fluid taken from this portion of the kidney. Now we know that glucose reuptake happens here at the PCT, the proximal convoluted tubule. At point C and indeed E, the glucose should have all been taken up, but we still have some here. So we can therefore say that the only region which could have contained any glucose would be the proximal convoluted tubule, which is where glucose reuptake occurs. So we can say in this question that our answer is going to be option B.